Okay, all right. So I'll do just a quick introduction because I'm actually very interested in hearing the content of the talk. So we have joined by two fantastic speakers who flew in today from Chile, yesterday, and from Brazil. Oh, so you came in, I thought you came together, but no, you came separately. So came from South America. And Cristobal I've known for years. We were reflecting on this a little bit at lunch today. We share a kind of like, both have this, one of the few sets of people who have this background in focus in innovation, studying innovation, and who've also sort of leveraged that to studying social movements and political organizing more broadly, especially using sort of new media. And so that's kind of something which we reflected here.
We met back at MIT.
Yeah, we met at MIT in a few different places, but also in the this sort of had a lot to talk about among the innovation crowd as well. And is at Catholic University in Chile and has done a bunch of work in these two different areas. And then Marissa we met today, but certainly familiar with her work. She actually gave me a copy of the new paperback copy of her book on building transnational networks from Cambridge University Press, and done a lot of work on mobilization, and social movements more broadly. And we were reflecting and saying that when she wrote this book a few years ago, the internet's not in this book, and yet as you'll see, a lot of the work that maybe it's not a whoops. I mean, you're sort of making up for it now in the sense that a lot of they've been working together on a really interesting body of research, of which this will be one sort of piece of an overview around student mobilizations in Chile between a series of 26 protests between 2011 and 2013 that probably at least broadly familiar with the happening. They'll tell us much more about that. So with that aside, thank you for being here and from coming from so far away to do so, and we're really interested and excited to hear more about this. So.
Thank you, Meiko. Thank you, everyone. And then I'm gonna
Thank you.
Marissa.
Thank you, everybody. We're very happy to be here. And in this really gorgeous day, we hear it's like that all winter long. So, no, really, thank you for being here. We look forward to your comments, criticism, because this is a work, preliminary results of a research project. So any criticism, comments, critiques, anything you have will be really useful for us. Okay. This is how we organize the presentation today. We'll begin by telling you a little bit about what the broader research project is, giving you some context, telling you a little bit about what the student movement is in Chile, and then our research questions, how they relate to what we think are key debates in the literature on activism and the internet, methods, data, of course, our results, and then hopefully we'll have some time to discuss our further steps and Q&A. Okay, so what we're presenting today, as Meiko explained, is a small piece of this broader research project that we called the Web in Movement, which was launched almost 2 years ago in March of 2013. We are a multidisciplinary and multinational group, and that's really important to us. We have a group of about 15 people, Cristobal, myself, and about 13 graduate and undergraduate students in Chile and now at the University of Brasilia as well, where I am right now, a professor at the Political Science Institute there. So the project right now has 1 foot in Chile and 1 foot in Brazil. And students, as we do, come from a variety of academic backgrounds. So I'm political science. We have students from sociology, computer science, engineering, and that's really has been very rich and exciting, and it has helped us look at this phenomenon from a variety of perspectives. And of course, we're focusing on one case and an in-depth look at one case of a social movement and understanding the impacts of digital tools on collective action. That's, of course, our general goal through time. So another important aspect of this project is that we're looking at 3 years of mobilizations and 3 years of use of digital platforms. So more specifically, our goals are also to analyze the impacts on power relations within the movement, study the changing roles of formal organizations, analyzing the interaction between online and offline repertoires of action, how repertoires are changing, and how online and offline types of action interact, and finally explore emerging leadership styles, new social media practices. Today we'll be speaking mostly about A, B, and C. So we use a mixed methods approach, qualitative, quantitative. We have a lot of data. If anyone wants to join us and have access to that data and take a look at it, will be most welcome. We look forward to collaborations because we have a Twitter database of around 1.5 million tweets. We'll speak about around 250,000 of those, which are the retweets in our database. Our YouTube database has over 3,000 videos. We're speaking about 3 years. So we're speaking really about a lot of information across internet platforms. So that's also something important in our research. It was designed from the beginning to be an across-platform kind of research design, which is of course possible because we're focusing on one social movement. We have lots of Facebook data. We're using nCapture. Some of you might be familiar with that from NVivo. We're using it to get posts, comments, shares, images, videos from fan pages. We did in 2011, 2012, mainly 44 semi-structured interviews. Those are mainly with student leaders, elected leaders of student organizations, but also people in charge of websites, people from other organizations that are not the formal student organizations. After that, we did 2 focus groups with 6 participants each. That sounds like not a lot, but it was actually really interesting and important for our research. We can talk about this later if you're interested in that kind of method. And of course, we are doing content analysis of the interviews, of the focus groups, of the documents. We have dozens of meeting minutes and other documents produced by students' organizations. And finally, participant observation has also been an important source of information for us of student meetings that we had access to and also student protests. Some of the members of our team, you will not be surprised to learn, are part of the student movement themselves. And so they have a special interest in participant observation. So a little bit about the case we're studying. Of course, 2011, as you know, was a year of protest around the world. And sometimes in the literature, we see the Chilean student mobilizations listed as part of a series of other mobilizations as though it was the same phenomenon as the Arab Spring, Indignados, Occupy type movements. In the paper, we emphasize that it's really a different type of mobilization we're talking about. So, and which is sometimes called the Chilean winter. This is, of course, a very traditional social movement, not only in Chile, but around the world. Students have mobilized for decades and decades. In Latin America, they have been key actors during transitions to democracy, the fight against military dictatorships in South America. Before then, in the 60s, they were a really important actor as well. So a new wave of mobilization isn't really all that surprising. But one of the interesting things about the social movement is not only it has been massive, but it has always had, a lot of impact on the public agenda. The students were able to put on the table, and it's being negotiated and talked about right now, a very broad student reform in Chile. Whether it will come out or not, and what kind of things will really change, it's still to be seen. This is still an ongoing, actually, mobilization, but it has already changed the agenda of political discussion in Chile. And that's really interesting because It began in May of 2011 with a very specific frame, with a very specific demand that was related to debt. Education, university level education in Chile is very expensive, and there are no good grant systems. So a lot of people have become indebted, Chilean families throughout the years. So the mobilizations began in May of 2011 with this focus on debt, on payment, on getting lower tuitions and better grants. So for instance, this girl is holding a Chilean flag that says 5 years studying, 15 years paying. It went from that through time to a broader frame. So in the end, as I said before, the students were asking for this really broad and very ambitious reform of educational policy in Chile, basically asking that as, for instance, in Brazil, there is a system of public, free, and high quality education at the university level. We could show you many things, but just so you have a sort of a more concrete idea of the kinds of mobilizations we're talking about, we want to show you a video that's actually in one of the YouTube channels of a student federation, the main student federation, of a flash mob, which is also actually one of the new things in the Chilean mobilization. It's about 3 minutes long, and it's the thriller for education. You will see why. Does it sound familiar? This is downtown Santiago, capital city.
I mean, the government palace. It's in front of the government palace. La Moneda.
a couple of members of our research team are writing a paper specifically on the flash mobs, because like this one, there were dozens of flash mobs. We chose to see this one here because it's actually an interesting example, next one, of organizationally enabled networks, if we follow Professor Bennett's typology and Segerberg, because some of the flash mobs are really examples of crowd-enabled networks. Thank you. In the sense that former student organizations did not really play a big role in organizing them. They were calls launched on the internet, events on Facebook, and people just showed up and took part in them. We have examples of that. In the case of the Thriller for Education, actually students, officials, elected officials from the main student federation played an interesting role. They were the ones that launched the idea, which was a student's idea, was not their idea, but it was just a grassroots idea. They launched the Facebook event. They were in charge of finding the Michael Jackson that you saw there, and they played a role in discussing the political presentation, so the role of the zombies and how the zombies symbolize capitalism, or what capitalism does to people. And you saw the t-shirts, some of them said dying in debt and capitalism exploitation, and that sort of political framing of the event, because in one of the interviews with the person in the federation that helped organize this, she was like, flash mobs, we usually don't even look at that. That's not very politically, that's not important politically. The important thing is to organize the protests and the speeches, and so, but the way they politicized it was through this discussion about the role of the zombies. And so for us, it's more an example of an organizationally enabled network than a crowd-enabled network, as other flash mobs are. But the key thing here is that if we take this typology, really within this case study, throughout time, we can see examples of these three types of networks in action. So what is this a case of? It's a case of a traditional social movement that enters the digital age, and we hope to make a contribution to the literature that sees how social movement organizations like the student organizations adapt to this digital age. So it's not a leaderless movement, it's not an organizationless movement, it's not like movements, perhaps the Occupy style movements, in the sense that offline social networks are really important, offline meeting spaces remain relevant, which of course doesn't mean that change is not happening. So, and it's exactly that we talk about. Okay, so for the paper we distributed before this talk, we focus on two main research questions. How are Chilean student movement actions appropriating different social media platforms? And here we will focus on Twitter. And what are the impacts of this appropriation on power relations among actors? And within Twitter, we're focusing on retweet networks. I think that these research questions already tell you a lot about sort of our theoretical approach and how we try to contribute to the literature on this topic, so we don't assume that actors are appropriating different social media platforms. We want to study how they do it. So it's very much a project that focuses on the agency of actors. So given a similar technological context, different actors will react to them in different ways. And that's what we really want to study, and how this has a dynamic through time, what happens through time. And we focus on processes and mechanisms that talk about power relations among actors. In the literature on organizations, we think that a contribution that a case study such as ours can make to the literature is that we sometimes see the literature as taking a very narrow view about the role of organizations. So I'm thinking about the work by Jennifer Earle, which we actually like a lot, and we cite it and we use it. But her approach to organizations in social movements, basically what she discusses is an Ausonian-based view of organizations and the argument that collective action is costly and how organizations play a key role in diminishing those costs. And in the internet, I'm simplifying here, but bear with me. But it's basically a narrow literature that's cited about how organizations play a key role in diminishing the costs of collective action. And although, of course, cost-based arguments are important in social movement literature, that's not all there is. And so in the paper, we mention one, Gamson's work on how organizations also play a key role in developing collective identity within social movements. And there's actually, we could cite Jay's, there's actually a whole literature that talks about the role of organizations in a broader way. So hopefully we can contribute to that debate somehow. And the other on power relations, and here we are, of course, very much hoping to dialogue with you and inspired by your work, which has focused a lot on power relations as well, is try to go beyond these social media platforms as arenas of struggle. Try to identify, and we do this a little bit on the paper, but we, of course, have to develop it more. What are some of the mechanisms of control displayed by actors? And what are mechanisms of disruption, or maybe we can call it in another way, of these power relations? Now, how is it exactly that actors attempt to control the internet? So, I think I have already said that. These research questions are related to two key debates: the changing role of formal organizations. Here we build also a lot on the work by Bruce Bimber and his colleagues on how formal organizations, the book they have on US social movement organizations, so, these are changing their role and not necessarily declining in power, quite the opposite sometimes. And of course the debate about power relations in social movement networks, both of which, by the way, are pre-internet debates. No, they're not new debates in the literature. Okay, Cristóbal will talk about the preliminary results we have. If I can get this, you do it.
Okay. Thank you, Marisa. So, as for the preliminary results, we can see or observe in terms of the student federations, which are the formal organizations of the higher, the formal organization of the students at the university level, how they use social media platforms or internet more in general. So more than half of these federations, university-based, have websites and they use it. Definitely Facebook and Twitter concentrate the good deal of usage. So almost 75% of the federations have accounts both in Twitter and in Facebook. And the YouTube, although important in certain areas, is less present. Almost maybe around 1/3 of the federation have YouTube accounts. And the association of the whole federations has a very important YouTube account where you saw the video before. So that also gives ground to our analysis on Twitter and Facebook, which has been kind of the main focus of our project, to really understand the meaning, understand the practices, understand how they use these two media, social media platforms. So what we have learned and what are some of the results in terms of this analysis and regarding to our appropriation of digital tools. So our research question number A. Is intense the appropriation and the use, but limited and quite heterogeneous in terms of appropriation, in terms of how actors, individuals, or formal organizations appropriate these tools. These open media platforms are perceived by elected leaders as being quite useful for information sharing and denouncing, police repression or denouncing, violence in comparison, of course, with decision making, because we try to understand what were the key objectives of each, media platform. And certainly security issues are key, and face-to-face fora or meetings remain quite important. Also, that's another probably important cultural context. In Latin America and in Chile, face-to-face interaction are quite important. And trust, since we have a kind of a low level of interpersonal trust in strangers, face-to-face is certainly quite important, not only for politics, but also for economics. But in this case, it's also something that it could be explaining some of the still relevance of face-to-face and physical encounters in the digital age, in our context. Then also what we have learned that, of course, there's different social media platforms are used for different purposes, that's no news, and different targets, and this vary through time. Twitter, most useful for information diffusion, sharing, mobilization, and debate with actors outside the movement. And Facebook, most useful to mobilize internally and share information with the base of students. So definitely with the base of students and the groups and the different subgroups among each federation, and within the group of federations that comprise the different university organizations, Facebook was quite important. And Twitter for, mobilizing, for protest action, as we will see, and also for debating and debating these issues in the public sphere, which, as Marisa mentioned, are right now in the table in the political discussion arena as of now. So Facebook has been a key platform for that one. And web pages, blogs, even photologs, which were very useful and relevant almost 10 years ago in the previous, in another previous student high school mobilizations, high school student mobilization, are declining in relevance as we can see. In terms of our relationship or question about Twitter and protest, what our preliminary findings, Twitter was gradually incorporated by leaders and organizations from 2011 onwards. Throughout the year of 2011, few pioneers and key leaders dominate the retweet networks, which are the networks that we study. But this is an interesting finding for us. A process of appropriation and institutionalization of Twitter by the student federations and related organizations started to take place from 2012. I'm going to explain more what I mean by this process of institutionalization or appropriation of the Twitter platform by the student federations. So for this analysis of this appropriation of Twitter by these different actors and formal organization actors, we look at this retweet at 250,000 approx retweets over 26 weeks of protest between March 2011 and November of 2013, and we perform some social network analysis to compare the centrality of the different actors, individuals, so individual actors and organizations, federations, and its dynamics through time. And we look at between the centrality, so which actors were more central in terms of their retweeting activity. What we found in this analysis of these 26 periods is the distribution, a sort of rhythm in terms of the protest. Here you can see a distribution. In this case, we're not analyzing the 26 weeks, but 13 weeks just in 2011, to give you an example of how Twitter was used the week of the protest, where the most activity of these networks, of this activity, happened the day of the protest. As you can see, that was the concentration of the Twitter activity happened the day of the protest, and a little bit beforehand and after it. So if we take 1 week of analysis, we basically analyze how this retweet activity were happening during that period analyzed. If we look, and this is important for our research question number 2, the retweets by type of actors over all this period, through time, in these 26 protest week periods, we find that at the beginning of the student movement, certainly the leaders and these pioneers were concentrating most of the percentage of the retweet activity. But then, since 2012, this individual celebrity activity by these leaders started to decline, and the formal institutions, the institutional accounts, the Twitter institutional accounts of these formal organizations, of the federations and related organizations, started to take more relevance, and they started to basically present more activity. So you can see in the blue line are the student organizations, the leaders in red, and other related organizations. So it's relevant that in 2013, both the student organizations and other related organizations concentrate more retweet activity than the student leaders. Question?
By leaders, do you mean political leaders?
I mean leaders from the student movement.
Right.
For the student movement, not political leaders of political parties, but the student leaders. This student movement has elected leaders in different federations, in different groups.
Does that overlap with the student organizations?
No, because the accounts on Twitter can be individual accounts. So that's exactly what we wanted to see, how individual leaders behave versus official. So, for instance, well, we will see with the social network graphs that individual leaders were much more central. For instance, the president of a federation, the account on Twitter was much more central than the account of this person's own federation. So leaders are presidents, vice presidents, or secretary generals of university federations,
Right.
and spokespeople of high school student organizations.
Thank you, Marisa. And actually, you can see, as Marisa said, this in this retweet network, by the size of the node, measuring the out degree centrality of each node, you can see the centrality and the concentration of these retweet networks by the two leaders of Giorgio Jackson was the leader of our university, the Student Federation of Catholic University, and Camila Vallejo was the leader of the Universidad de Chile Student Federation, the main two universities of Chile, and they concentrated they were the most central nodes in the graph, in the retweet graph, by September 22nd in 2011. And you can see quite the relevance of this one, and if you go 1 year later, approximately, you start to see, you know, a less centrality. So the amount of the relevance of Camila Vallejo started to decrease, and new institutional actors, meaning, you know, institutional accounts, because that's what we're looking. Our data is or a personal account in Twitter or an institutional account on Twitter by high school student federation, higher education. There's some extra, but you can see these ones that are La Fech is the student association of the Universidad de Chile, the main university in Chile. So we start to see this increasing relevance, you see, of these institutional organizational accounts that we claim that has to do with a certain institutionalization and formalization of the process, but you know, it's something that we can discuss further. And then in 2013, the pattern is also, you know, refer what we're saying. We see emerging political associations, you know, new organizations and formal organization, even the Communist Youth Association, or Communist Youth from the Communist Party, Communist Youth Party Association, FEUSUH, and others. These years is also a little bit, we see more participation of formal political actors, meaning political actors because it's an election year. So also it's something that started to make some noise in our data because we have political elections and then you have a participation of more institutionalized actors. But given said that, we still see this pattern of decreasing centrality of these formal leaders, of these individual leaders, president of federations, and increasing centrality of the institutional accounts. So what we learn from this is that Twitter is certainly also an arena of power struggles and attempts of control. That's what we mentioned, and we kind of try to put that idea in the title of the paper, which is who is trying to control the message in Twitter, whether the individuals that they were very active and giving centrality, but now we see new institutional accounts and new organizations, formal organizations that are trying to kind of restore the order and taking a little bit of control of the message. So there's certainly something going on in these attempts of control and disruption and this interplay between individuals and their organizations. We see a reproduction and reinforcement of offline asymmetries, and there's also, however, less visible actors' attempts at gaining greater visibility and influence. Of course, there's new actors that are trying to get visibility in this arena of contestation and discussion. And our further work has to do, we're starting to perform some sentiment analysis and content analysis on tweets and retweets. Until this point, we've done just a structural network analysis to claim what we said about this process of institutionalization and more appropriation by the organizations, but we haven't looked fully at the content of this information that is going on. So we're performing that analysis as we speak, and it's a new line of work that has to do which are the content that these individuals or these organizations are talking about, and we can measure the impact, the influence of, and the emotions of this different type of content. So it's something that will probably shed light in some of our hypotheses. And then comparison, we're performing some comparison on Twitter strategies by specific actors. So how these different leaders, individual leaders or institutional formal organizations, perform different rhetorics or perform different actions and different content to gain more visibility, more centrality in the network. And then I think since this is a case study over time, we also are trying to make connections and compare, to other cases in the literature and other cases that colleagues here and elsewhere are studying and looking, because I think we believe that the Chilean case presents some differences and some particularities, but on the other hand, I think we think that some of this evidence and patterns that we're seeing here can also shed light in movements or can shed light in patterns that are appearing in other cases elsewhere in the world. And with that, we say thank you, obrigado, gracias for your attention.